I guess we're on now. This is the last in my series of lectures and our series of discussions concerning the 2 volumes of Deleuze's cinema. The topic for today is a cinema of the brain and conclusions. And so we're going to be going through a very difficult part of the 2nd volume fairly quickly. There's quite a bit to read and quite a bit to discuss, but I'm going to focus on a particular theme, and that is what Deleuze calls a cinema of the brain. The brain began to interest Deleuze in his later period. He wrote a couple of things that were apropos of the brain, including an introduction to his earlier work on Bergson's philosophy, a book that has been translated into English as Bergsonism. The original was written in 1964, but Deleuze wrote a new introduction before he died, in which he talks about the fact that he asks, how can we extend Bergson's analyses of memory and of time? And he suggests that one way to do it is in relation to the new neurosciences. Now, Deleuze died in 1995, and he wrote the 2nd volume, or published the 2nd volume of Cinema in 1985. The material that he relies on for his conception of a new neuroscience is mostly from a book by the British neuroscientist Stephen Rose. Rose wrote a book called The Conscious Brain, which is an excellent piece of work. I read it years ago, and I still have a copy of it on my shelf. And that's the book that Deleuze references in the footnotes to the 2nd volume of Cinema as his primary source for understanding what he calls the nature of the new brain. Well, in addition to suggesting that a more concentrated interest in the neurosciences would add something to the analysis of memory and of time in Bergson, Deleuze introduces this as a specific trend, a specific theme of modern cinema, the distinction between classical cinema and modern cinema being the distinction between pre-World War II, mostly American film, and then post-World War II, mostly European film. Although Latin America also has a big role to play in modern cinema, as does Africa, as does Iran, although that was a development that followed Deleuze's own work. Well, in any event, what's he talking about in terms of a new brain or a new understanding of the brain? He uses both terms. And in fact, he suggests that the new neuroscience is itself the result of a new relationship between human beings and their brains. He never really explains that, but he seems to think that there's been a fundamental shift in understanding that has influenced science to take a new approach to the study of the brain. If you take a look at Rose's book, he presents the current state of neuroscience in when did the book get published? Probably around 1975, something like that. He reports on the current state of neuroscience. There's a chapter on the evolution of brains in different animal phyla. There's a chapter on overall brain structure, and then on the microstructure of neurons. And also, he raises questions in the ethics of neuroscience, including questions having to do with psychopharmacological drugs and the use of psychoactive drugs in general. And then he asks, in the very final chapter, if I'm remembering correctly, do brains have a future? Rose was a radical, political radical, as well as a neuroscientist, which is an unusual combination, especially today. And so the book has a kind of radical tinge to it, a politically radical tinge, as well as being a great introduction to the state of neuroscience in the mid-70s. Deleuze read the book and was very influenced by it. So what does he tell us? He tells us that the classical view of the brain, and I have no idea what he's referring to here, I must say. The classical view of the brain is the conception of the brain as organized in 2 ways. One involves the poles of what he refers to as integration and differentiation. Integration and differentiation. The second axis of brain functioning involves the involves the idea of the association of elements, and there are two fashions in which association occurs. One is contiguity, and the other is similarity. Let me focus on the second first, because it's easy to see where he's getting that from. Contiguity and similarity are really terms that belong in psychology, and they were aspects of mental functioning that influenced even early modern philosophers like David Hume and John Locke and so forth. So the idea is very simple, and that is that the mind works through the medium of association, whether that's association of thoughts or association of images. And the mind moves from one image or one thought to the next in accordance with two primary principles. One is similarity or resemblance. So when we are thinking, the transitions that are most natural occur in accordance with images that the transitions that are most natural occur to images that are similar to the ones that we already have or that we're having currently, or to thoughts that are similar to the one that we're currently having. That's one principle of association. The other principle is contiguity, and what this means is that images that are naturally together, that naturally come together, tend to follow each other in thought. So if I always see you with your husband, for example, then I'm likely to think of your husband when I think of you. That's an example of association by contiguity. The two of you are always together, and therefore my thought moves from a thought of you to a thought of him. Similarity, if you happen to remind me, you look like a friend that I had in college, then when I think of you, I'll think of the friend. And so that's an association by similarity. In essence, that axis of brain functioning involves images, and I would say non-conceptual thoughts, although there's a long debate in early psychology about whether there is such a thing as thought that doesn't take the form of concepts. But let's talk about that as a linkage of images, essentially a linkage of images according to similarity and contiguity. The other axis is the axis of integration and differentiation. And here Deleuze tells us that they pertain to concepts. So what does he have in mind here? I think what he has in mind is a basic logical structure that Plato is the first one to talk about, namely the structure of division, and that Aristotle then takes up in his genus-species classification of, based on biological organisms. In other words, as you move from the more specific to the more generic, you are integrating, so that what comes below on the logical scale gets integrated into what comes above on the logical scale. So let's begin with something like, I don't know, squirrels, and then we group them into the genus mammals, and then we group mammals into a higher genus, namely animals, and then animals into a higher genus, living things, and then living things into a higher genus, whatever it would be, visible entities. And then finally we get to not a highest genus, because Aristotle will tell us that there is no such thing as a highest genus. But as we move up the ladder, from the more specific to the more generic, we're integrating what's on the lower levels in the higher levels. This is also in logic called subsumption. We're subsuming the specific under the general. And differentiation is simply the opposite pathway. So you begin with a genus, and then you determine what the specific differences are of the groups or classifications that fall under the genus. So for example, let's take the example of animals. How do you differentiate the genus of animals? Well, you've got to distinguish. You can do it in different ways, but one way to do it is to distinguish between animals that bear their young live and animals that do not bear their young live, that lay eggs and so forth. Or you might want to distinguish between warm-blooded and cold-blooded animals. Or you could distinguish between animals that walk on legs and animals that don't. Or animals that fly and animals that walk on legs and animals that move through the water. You might have three differentia that enable you to move from the more generic to the more specific. That's the process of differentiation. And then the opposite process is the process of integration. Now, these are just sort of time-honored conceptions of the way the mind works on the level of conceptual logic. And so what Deleuze claims is that the so-called classical view of the brain involves those two axes, and that's what defines the classical view. But as I said, I'm not really sure what he's referring to here, because brain science doesn't begin until fairly late in the game. There's some brain science as early as the 17th century, but as soon as things really get moving, fairly shortly, there is, for example, the identification of neuronal structure. When the microscope becomes available, when von Leeuwenhoek invents it in the 1700s, one of the easiest things to do is to take a look at brain tissue under the microscope and to make drawings of what we now call neurons and so forth. So I'm not sure exactly what he means by the classical theory. But he sees the classical theory, whatever it is, as having been modified by Bergson in the book Matter and Memory, which is his main source, his main Bergsonian source for the 2 volumes of Cinema. And so what Bergson does is very simple. He says that the brain is an instrument of action, not an instrument of thought. It's an instrument of action. And that its function is to introduce a gap between stimulus and response. So an example of a stimulus response circuit that doesn't have a gap is a reflex circuit. The doctor hits you on the knee with a little hammer and your leg jerks out, right? There's nothing free about that action. It's automatic action. What the brain does is it introduces a gap in the stimulus response circuit. And in that gap is where things like choice and decision are located. So once there's a gap, it's possible for me to select between alternative courses of action. And action no longer becomes an automatic response to a stimulus. And this is an important element in Bergson's conception of the way the mind works and the way the universe works in Matter and Memory, because everything that's contributed by what we refer to as thought is really a matter of awakening memory. And memory exists in a virtual dimension. Memory is not material, it's virtual, or it's in Bergson's terminology, spiritual in character. There's a link between the material and the spiritual because those thoughts, those memories that are relevant to action are called up in relation to what we must do in the world, what we must accomplish in the world. And so normally our thoughts are filtered, in a sense, through our actions and through our choices to act in one way rather than the other. But nonetheless, the thoughts that are relevant to action are not located in the brain for the same reason that memories in general are not located within the brain. The brain is a material locus, and it's not the kind of thing that could possibly hold images or thoughts or concepts or whatever. And so Deleuze sees this as a major step forward in the understanding of the brain. But now he's on more solid ground post-Bergson. He says that after Bergson, there is the new neuroscience. And so what does he mean by the new neuroscience? Well, essentially, it's what Stephen Rose describes in his book, The Conscious Brain. And in the new neuroscience, there are two developments. One is that microfissures are introduced, microfissures. Now, what he's referring to as microfissures are simply synapses. They're gaps between the axons of one cell and the bodies or the dendrites of another cell. You know, we all know how neural transmission works. The neurons are not connected the way electronic components are. They don't join to one another. There's a gap between them, and then into the gap, into the synaptic cleft, sometimes called, neurotransmitters are released in response to a certain voltage of electrochemical activity along the length of the axon. And depending upon the number of neurotransmitter packets that are released and the condition of the receptors on the other side, on the other cell, and then there are new mental health slogan. Oh, well, let me actually, I don't think I have the, let me put the question and answer on. I don't think I've got that. Okay, that's now up. All right, sorry about that. In any event, microfissures are synaptic gaps. And the thing about the synaptic gap is that it's a highly complex system. It's not like turning on a switch and having a light bulb light up. I guess that really is what he is referring to as the pre-contemporary view of the brain. And actually, if you take a look at, for example, cartoons in the 1940s or in the 1950s, the brain is inevitably portrayed as a telephone exchange, where the operator is taking is unplugging a cable from one contact and plugging it into another. But this is not the way the brain works, and the reason why is that there are these gaps in which complex electrochemical events occur. And then depending upon the outcome of those complex events, and depending upon the outcome of myriad complex events that are coming from other axons that are synapsing onto the same cell body or the same dendrite, the cell that's being synapsed onto decides whether or not it is going to fire an impulse down its axon and release neurotransmitters into the cleft. But even now, it's not well understood why it is that the next cell fires, what the conditions are of firing. Some neurotransmitters are inhibitory. They inhibit firing. Some are excitatory. They excite firing. They increase the possibility of firing. But whether the cell fires or not is the result of a complex set of chemical and electrical processes. And so the brain gets described in probabilistic or stochastic terms rather than in mechanical terms. Even the mechanical terms of a telephone exchange. It's an electrical entity, but nonetheless, you take one cable out of one hole and you plug it in another, and you get a different line, a different call coming in, or whatnot. Here, what we've got is an event that happens, and it's of such a high level of complexity that we can only describe the outcome in terms of probabilities. And so you see, this is in a way building on Bergson's idea that the brain is a gap, that there's a gap between stimulus and response. In this case, there's a gap in every neural connection. And there are as many neural connections in the brain. Another way of saying this is to say that there are as many possible brain states as there are particles in the physical universe. So when you talk about the brain and the functioning of the brain, what you're talking about is a highly probabilistic system. A system where every micro event has a gap. And so, so this is one way in which the new conception, according to Deleuze, of the brain differs from the old conception of the brain. Well, the other way in which it differs, and this is a little bit more difficult to grasp, is Deleuze says that the modern conception of the brain no longer involves the notion of a simple inside and outside, sort of what is within the brain and what is outside of it. But what it involves is a more complex topological conception in which the outside becomes the inside and the inside becomes the outside. And the only thing that I can think of, because this is not from Rose's book, the only thing that I can think of, oh, I just froze. Can you hear me, Mac? Can people hear me? Hello.
I can hear you.
Okay, my image froze for some reason. Let me see if I can disable my camera and then start it again. Um, yeah, my image froze. Let's see here. Why can't I get up there? No, I don't have any control at all over anything here on screen. Nothing. That's very odd. I'm going to exit and come back in if I can, because it has frozen on me. Hold on a second, folks. Give me a second.
Gary, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Pixels. Yes.
Okay, is everything else in your computer screen frozen?
No, I'm able to use the rest of the computer, but on this particular page of the Apple computer, I can't do anything.
Okay.
Okay, so let me get out of it, and then I will, re-enter.
Okay. Either you re-enter or we'll have to come back to you since you're hosting this.
Yeah. Okay. Let me see if I can re-enter. Hold on.
Okay.
No, I can't get. No, actually, that's not working either. I'm gonna have to reboot the computer. It seems because I don't have any. Oh, wait a minute now. Wait a minute. Wait. Let's see. Something. Am I able to get in here? Hold on 1 second. Nope. I'm gonna have to reboot. So you guys sit tight. I'll reboot and come back in, and then if that doesn't work, you'll have to, make a new journey in. But I need to get control of the computer because I have none. I'm going to have to reboot. Okay, I'll see you in a bit.
Can you hear me, Mac? Oh, but you're yeah. Oh, there you are. Okay. So you're working. Well, anyway, I'm going to put I don't know if the link will still work when Gary comes back in, so maybe I'll put it back up. But interesting that he was talking about the brain and, the external part of the brain or something. There's an article that they just posted, and I was going to put a link to it, that they have mapped an atlas of the brain where words tend to associate. And it's really interesting. It's like certain words that we hear actually associate with different areas of the brain.
Right.
So it's a I want to give that to Gary for this, but anyway, thought that was kind of a very it has a very cool visual potion.
Okay,
But
looks like
there you are.
Forms though.
Anyway, well, you were just talking about the brain. I was mentioning Mac while you were gone. I'm going to put this link on here. It's
Okay.
They just mapped what they call the atlas of the brain.
Oh. Wonderful.
And basically, these are words that they have figured out. If you take the complete surface of the brain and it's mapped as an atlas of words. So certain words like kill or they tend to appear or function, you'll see somehow they associate with this part of the brain, or different words associate with this part of the brain. So
Right.
it must be, so since we're talking words, images would also transfer to words. I would assume, so if you're watching somebody be killed, I would imagine that would also have some relevance. But anyway, as you're talking about, and I think it's interesting because you're referencing a book that's quite old, and the neuroscience has just jumped light years from that time to today. And this is one of the examples.
Yeah, that's true, but I do think that the idea of the stochastic nature of neural transmission is central to contemporary neuroscience. Of course, there have been all kinds of advances. But yeah, and this is a basic point that he makes. And I think the idea of the inside becoming the outside and the outside becoming the inside, it's really just in the new topology of the brain. The only thing that I can think of that refers to is the fact that neural tissue it turns in on itself. If you think about the brain, you've got stuff that tucks under other stuff, and the outside becomes the inside, and the inside becomes the outside. But don't kill me if that's not what he meant, because this is just a wild guess on my part. Like I said, the inside and the outside thing is not something that's in Rose's book. Well, in any event, that isn't the point. The point is that on the basis of this new conception of the brain, Deleuze thinks it's possible to understand a particular trend in modern cinema. And so this, the trend is the tendency of modern directors to develop a cinema of the body or a cinema of the brain. And the cinema of the brain, of course, involves this stochastic view that I talked about, microfissures. The cinema of the body focuses on the body as what gives rise to thought. And here, I've got to say that behind this whole discussion is Spinoza. Spinoza develops the idea, there's a line in Spinoza's Ethics, which Deleuze repeats, and namely, give me a body. It's the idea that we're constantly thinking about what the mind does, but we understand very little of what the body does. We don't know what the body does in detail when it dreams, or when it's ill, or when it regenerates, or when it grows, and so forth. So Spinoza is the first philosopher to say this, that a philosophy should be oriented on the body rather than on the mind. And for Spinoza, body and mind are the same thing regarded from different viewpoints, but it's much easier to study that common entity from the physical side. Anatomy is beginning to develop as a modern science. The microscope has been invented, and so on and so forth. So we need to understand the body. And so what Deleuze tells us is that some modern directors are filmmakers of the body. And who's he talking about here? Well, he gives several examples. Two of them come to my mind in just remembering this. One is John Cassavetes, and the other is Jean-Luc Godard. Cassavetes is probably one of the most significant filmmakers, American filmmakers of the post-World War II period, whose approach to filmmaking is much closer to that of Europeans than of the American film tradition, even as it gets transformed in people like David Lynch. Cassavetes was an actor, of course. He has the male lead in Rosemary's Baby. I think that's probably the role that he's best known for. But he was an independent filmmaker, and when he made films like Shadows, Faces, Husbands, A Woman Under the Influence, The Killing of a Chinese Bookie, and so forth, he adopted certain techniques that were associated with cinema verite, namely, for example, handheld cameras. The cameras in his movies are handheld. The actors in his films, he has a core of professional actors that include Peter Falk, Ben Gazzara, and there are a couple of others, but he often populates his movies with non-professionals.
Jenna Rollins, you can't forget, his wife.
Yeah, his wife is one. His wife bridges the gap. His wife is both a relative and a great actress. But he has in his movies Gina Rollins' parents. Her mother plays in many Cassavetes films, not a professional actress. Cassavetes' mother appears in his movies. His kids appear in his movies. Peter Falk's kids appear in his movies. And often what he does is he explores kind of the raw character of family life and of the, for example, Husbands is a classic that does this. These are three guys who get together when the fourth guy dies, and they go on a binge that takes them all the way to London. And two of them return. One stays in London. In the final scene of the film, the two of them who return with big bags of presents that they've bought for their kids in an attempt to make peace with their children and their wives after the binge, right? Well, that hardly describes the film. What happens in the film is a matter of the interaction of the characters, that it's constantly changing, handheld cameras, but also very rapid patter. Many people think that his films were not scripted, that they were ad-libbed, but that's not true. They were all scripted. and he just rehearsed his actors very well. But other films, A Woman Under the Influence, same deal. It's a family drama, involves Gina Rowlands and Peter Falk playing her husband. She has a mental breakdown. The other members of the family on screen are members from 3 or 4 of their actual families, and that kind of thing. Now, what the 2 films that started Cassavetes' career as an independent director are Shadows and Faces. Shadows is about an African-American woman who is attempting to pass as a white woman. And actually, there are a couple of characters in that category. And so it explores race. But it explores race through the body, which is obviously the way race must be explored, because it's the body that becomes the marker for race. And the idea of when racial characteristics are ambiguous, what kinds of social interactions can the body sustain as it portrays itself in various ways? It's a very interesting film. And the second film, Faces, is almost it's almost a sort of Joan of Arc redone, but redone in cinema verite fashion. A lot of close-ups. Gina Rowlands is in it. A lot of close-ups of her face, of the other characters' faces, but also a lot of fast talking, quick interactions. And then also this feeling of the physical presence of the people that Cassavetes is filming, the palpably physical presence of the people that Cassavetes is filming, and what happens in the film is registered on their faces. Gina Rowlands plays a prostitute, actually a sort of high-class call girl in this movie. Well, in any event, I think there's some reason for calling Cassavetes a filmmaker of the body. He focuses on the body, and especially in those 2 initial movies. Godard, it's a little bit more complicated because, and the reason why I chose Alphaville as the film to watch this week is that Alphaville is not primarily a film of the body. It's what Godard calls a film of the brain, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But in general, he typifies Godard as a filmmaker of the body. And here he's referring to, for example, First Name Carmen, which is a movie that Godard made in the 70s, in the mid-70s, maybe early 80s. It's about Godard himself plays in the film. He plays himself, and he plays himself as in a mental institution. He plays himself as a disgusting character, by the way, which I think is fascinating. He's Jean-Luc Godard in the movie, but he portrays himself as an execrable character. But the film has burlesque elements in it. There's a young woman in the film who pulls off a bank job along with several other comrades. It's a political bank job. They're robbing a bank in order to fund a radical political project. And the scene of the bank robbery is done in burlesque, even though people are killed and so forth. And so what you have is bodies bumping into each other. If you think about Alphaville, there are scenes in Alphaville that support this idea that Godard is a director of the cinema of the body. For example, at the very end of the film, where Alpha 60 breaks down and the inhabitants of Alphaville have to deal with this new reality, you see people stumbling through the hallways as though they can no longer keep their balance. They're falling over, they're falling into walls and so forth. This is the kind of thing that Godard refers to when he talks about, that Deleuze refers to when he talks about Godard being a filmmaker of the body. But I think that that's a very inadequate way to characterize Godard, even given the 2 poles that Deleuze refers to, a cinema of the body and a cinema of the brain. Godard's work is far more complex than that. You can't locate it exclusively on one of those 2 sides. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, to me it seems like Alphaville is actually both.
You could say that, yeah. There are definitely elements that verge on what I call burlesque. Another element that occurs to me is the shooting in the bathroom when Lemmy Caution first checks into his hotel room. We have no idea why there's a person in the bathroom, but there's a gunfight and he shoots the guy, and then nothing is ever said about it. But it's done almost in burlesque.
Well, I see it as, but the reason I was bringing it up is like, you know, of the body, meaning everybody's comatose in a sense because they're being controlled except for Lemmy.
That's
But
true.
Lemmy's mind is active and aware of what's going on. So he is the mind,
Well,
whereas,
yeah,
in
we'll
a
see.
sense.
We'll see. We'll see. Let me talk a little bit about Godard's career, though, because Godard is one of the major modern filmmakers. He's still alive. He's in his 80s now, and I believe his most recent film was called The End of Language. His filmmaking has become so, how can I put it, so hermetic, so arcane that even critics don't watch him anymore. It's very difficult to get through a contemporary Godard film. I happen to still love his work, so I watch it. Film Socialism, for example, is also a recent movie. I think it's the movie prior to the last one that he made, which I think is a brilliant film, but it's very hard to watch through. In any event, Godard started the way many members of the French New Wave started, namely as writers for Cahiers du Cinéma, which is the journal that was founded by André Bazin. And so there were a group of young critics, including Truffaut, Rivette, the other major figures in the New Wave, who began as simply film theorists and film critics writing for that journal. And then essentially what happened was that people said to them, you think you're so smart, why don't you try making movies? And they all did, and they all became great filmmakers. And Godard was one of them. Godard and Truffaut were very close, especially early on. And both of them were fairly close with André Bazin, who founded the journal. But Godard's first film was, actually, they both made brilliant first movies. Truffaut made 100 Blows, which is a great film. It was his first movie. And then Godard's first film was Breathless, which is also a great film. There may have been short films done before that, but that was the first feature film. And in Breathless is a unique movie. It's about a criminal, and it follows some of the conventions of film noir, but it's done in such a way that imagery is significant in a way that it hadn't been before in film, especially imagery that comes from Hollywood, posters of Hollywood films. The main character plays at being Humphrey Bogart, for example. But then there's also this cinematic technique that he uses throughout the film that hit the critics like a bomb, and that is the jump cut. The jump cut was used in the earliest forms of filmmaking by Méliès, for example, the French filmmaker, the magician turned filmmaker, who would create magical effects by clipping portions of the film strip and removing them from the film strip and then just putting those two ends together. It was a kind of editing that creates these transitions, instantaneous transitions between moments of time, but that are now separated by blank temporal spaces. So if somebody's running, for example, you begin by filming the run, and you might show 5 seconds of the run, and then you excise the next 2 seconds, and then you edit the strip by connecting it to the portion of the run that occurs after 2 seconds, and then you let it go for another 3 seconds, and then you clip out another piece, and so he does this throughout the film, and it has an incredible effect. Including in the portrayal of one of the central crimes in the movie, the murder of a policeman, and so forth. And it changes our experience of time in very interesting ways. The fascinating thing about that film is that when Godard was later interviewed, he said, "I had no idea what I was doing when I made that movie. As a matter of fact, I was just trying to keep it to the right length." That's why I snipped out all these parts of the film. And but it turned out that the critics loved it. But that's a little hard to believe. He does say this in an interview. It's a little hard to believe because he then builds on that technique in other movies. Godard is a filmmaker who is interested in making films in which the process of filmmaking is reflected within the film, like the lead character in Breathless, who emulates Humphrey Bogart. He looks at posters of Humphrey Bogart films and sort of affects the mannerisms of Humphrey Bogart, that kind of thing. I've written about this. Godard is doing movie making in a period in the history of French cinema where Hollywood is very central. The market has been just recently flooded with Hollywood films. Also, images are ubiquitous now after the Reconstruction at the end of the Second World War. Posters, advertisements, television has been invented. The cinema, it plays a major role in France, and so imagery becomes a central characteristic of the public experience of everyone. And Godard incorporates this in self-reflective ways into his movie making. One of the reasons why this sets up Godard nicely for Deleuze's treatment is that Godard is interested in the way images connect with one another. And he's also interested in the way images and sounds connect with one another. And he experiments throughout his films in image-to-image and sound-to-image connections, altering the way that they go, refusing to obey the logic of perceptual experience, for example, matching. He's also, by the way, interested in the shapes of letters. Godard's credits are famous, and they're a big part of his films. He's a great filmmaker. He had a career that spanned a lot of years. He was a political radical, a Maoist, and a revolutionary in the late 60s and early 70s. Worked with a group called the Dziga Vertov group. Dziga Vertov was a Soviet filmmaker from the early period. He then got involved in a car accident, which took him out of commission, and long, great career. Well, okay. Let's take a look at first of all, what Deleuze means by a cinema of the brain. He refers to a couple of filmmakers as people who specialize in this kind of cinema. I'm going to focus on Stanley Kubrick. Alain Resnais is another one, but we've talked about Alain Resnais before. Let's take a look at Kubrick, because Kubrick's movies fit so nicely into this paradigm. To talk about a cinema of the brain is not to say that the cinema focuses on intellectual operations or even thoughts. It's to say that the director models the film on the structure of the brain. And so, for example, this is obvious in something like Stanley Kubrick's 2001, in which there are really kind of two images of the brain that run throughout the movie. One is of the monolith, the black monolith, which is what initiates the process of human evolution, is then found on the moon, beams a message to the planet Jupiter, then reappears as a stargate through which the astronaut, played by Keir Dullea, moves into light years distant from where he began and into another kind of dimension, which is both mental and physical at the same time. He ages rapidly, then returns to Earth as a fetus, and the whole bit. The second brain in the film is Hal, the computer. Hal was created on Arthur C. Clarke is the person who wrote the screenplay. Clarke is a well-known science fiction writer. This was not a book by Clarke turned into a film. It was a film idea that Kubrick had that Clarke wrote the screenplay for. But the two of them consulted with Marvin Minsky when they made the movie. Marvin Minsky ran the artificial intelligence lab at MIT. And Minsky, like a lot of the artificial intelligentsia of that period, had wild ideas about what was just around the corner. So they asked Minsky, what are computers going to be like in the year 2001? And Minsky said, well, obviously, they'll be fully intelligent and conscious. Right? So HAL was developed on the basis of Minsky's projection of what computers would be like in the year 2001. HAL is not just a computer, but HAL is, in a sense, the entire spaceship. The spaceship is kind of the body of the HAL mind. HAL controls the spaceship in which the astronauts are traveling to Jupiter to discover the location that the monolith beamed the message to when it was found on the moon. HAL is in contact with the astronauts, but HAL begins to make decisions on his own. And he begins to make decisions about, in particular, they're concerned with the breakdown of one of the systems, forget what, on the exterior of the spacecraft. But HAL is worried that if they are allowed to pursue that the mission will be called off, and HAL is dedicated to seeing the mission through. So they try to hide from HAL to prevent HAL from understanding what it is that they're talking with one another about, but HAL lip reads as well as understands spoken natural language, and so he strands one of the astronauts, actually strands both of them outside of the ship. One of them is killed in the process of being stranded. The other one, Deleuze, figures his way back in to the ship through a hatch and then goes directly into the inner brain of HAL and essentially lobotomizes the computer. There's a great scene where he's got a screwdriver and he's screwing up below these logic units, and they sort of slowly come out. And as they slowly come out, they're disconnected from the brain, and HAL's mind degenerates as this happens. It's a great scene. He says, Dave, I'm losing my mind, Dave. I can feel it, Dave. It's a great scene. I love that scene. But in any event, the idea here is that it's not just thought it's not the thought that a person is having that's significant. It's the fact that the entirety of the universe, in essence, in 2001 is a mind. It's a complex mind. It's also got components. The monolith is a part of it, and so is the computer HAL, and so on. Human beings have a destiny here, but they have a destiny as beings with brains. The beginning of the film is what starts the evolutionary process, the development of the human brain out of the early hominid brain through the monolith's communication of a form of technology. In other words, the use of bones as weapons to the early pre-human hominids and that kind of thing. Well, okay. What Deleuze tells us is that this kind of brain writ large appears again and again in Kubrick's films. So if you think about A Clockwork Orange, for example, the whole of society in A Clockwork Orange is a brain. It's a brain that's gone awry. It's a brain that's dedicated to the control of the individuals who live in the society through methods of brainwashing, of violence. The chief character at the beginning of the film is a violent criminal who engages in murder, rapes, so forth, until finally he is reprogrammed by the society and becomes now an instrument of the violence of the society. A Clockwork Orange, what does it refer to? Well, it refers to an organic entity that works like a machine. And so what we have here is the idea of society as a machine, of society as a kind of a brain, a clockwork orange. And then it'll even appear, according to Deleuze, this notion of the cinema of the brain also appears in films like Dr. Strangelove, where the control room, where the president and the generals and so forth are seated with screens all around, planning their actions in this entree to nuclear holocaust and so on. Peter Sellers plays multiple characters in the film, but the room, the control room, is a gigantic brain. Deleuze tells us, and there are other places where it occurs as well in Kubrick's filmmaking. Now,
like The Shining,
The Shining, the Overlook
and
Hotel, right?
which I actually worked in
Yeah,
1976.
yeah,
It was the Stanley Hotel, but that's where Stephen
yeah,
King and
yeah,
got used that environment as
yeah.
the quote brain. And it is very much a brain because the hotel itself is alive with, or either it's alive as the brain, or it's Jack's mind, the character.
Right, exactly. Exactly. The memories, if you take a literal reading of the scenario in The Shining, the apparitions that the boy sees and that Jack sees in the hotel are, as Scatman Carruthers' character, as the Scatman Carruthers character tells us, they are traces of former events. In other words, they're memories. But they're memories of things that happened. And as Scatman Carruthers says, a lot happened in the Overlook Hotel over the years, and not all of it was good. Right? So there are murders that occur, and there are sexual perversions that occur, and so forth. And these things crop up again and again as memories of the hotel. And so what
And,
you have, yeah,
and that's actually a device that's been used over and over and over again in horror movies. I think like House on a Hill or
exactly. What's a haunted house anyway, except a house, a gigantic mind, right?
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I think all of this makes perfect sense. And Renee, if you think about this again, Pixels, because you hate it, you told me that I owed you, I don't know what it was, 2 hours of your life back for making you watch last year at Marienbad. But think of the hotel as a brain.
But I remember I said I liked Je suis, Je suis.
Yes. Oh, by the way,
And
I watched that.
which, and
It's
what'd you
totally
think?
an excellent film. It's an excellent film. Wonderful film.
I think
And
why I liked it, I think honestly it has a little slightly more narrative element to it than
yeah,
Marion Bot does.
yeah. It's Je t'aime, by the way. I love you is the name of the film. Yeah, and actually, okay, let's look at that film because that's a good film for illustrating what Deleuze means by a cinema of the brain. Now, what he's really talking about is a particular way of connecting images, and a particular way of connecting images and sounds. If you have a contemporary view of the brain, then what you're going to do is you're going to focus on the idea of micro fissures between images and between images and sound, namely things that are the correlates of synaptic gaps. And here he develops a theory, which is that there are two ways of cutting in film, essentially two ways of editing in film. In one fashion, the cut belongs to one of the two strips of film where the cut is made. In other words, if you cut at a particular frame, the frame either belongs with the sequence of film before the cut or it belongs with the sequence of film after the cut. There might be a gap there, but it's a gap across which we make a bridge. And so this is true, for example, in classical montage technique. For example, let's say that I'm thinking of October, which is a film by Eisenstein. In that film, what you have is one statue, which is being filmed in montage form. So first of all, you're getting an image, maybe a 2-second image with the camera looking at it from this angle, and then looking at it from this angle, and then looking at it from this angle. And so what happens is there are gaps between the elements of the montage, but we bridge the gaps naturally. And we understand that these are all facets of a single object. Deleuze distinguishes that from what he calls the irrational cut. In the irrational cut, the cut belongs to neither series. And so there is an absolute gap between the two sets of images, a gap that the mind of the viewer cannot bridge. And so now, once you cut film in that way, then your task becomes putting the film together in a way that makes sense in accordance with the logic of the movie, but that has no standard narrative logic or even standard visual perceptual logic. So you make irrational cuts, and then you put together the the film sequences. You relink what has been cut with other images in ways that do not obey narrative logic or perceptual logic. We can see this, for example, we can see this certainly in Je t'aime, but since we've watched for this week Alphaville, you can see it in Alphaville. There are images that are out of place, that don't have any. Well, for example, why is there negative footage toward the end of the movie? There's a scene where Lemmy Caution comes out after having shot, Dr. von Braun, and he comes out of the office building, and then all of a sudden, the film becomes a negative rather than a positive. And this occurs twice within the same maybe 3 or 4 minute stretch of film. What do you have here? Well, you have a cut in the sense that Deleuze is talking about, a cut, right? You have a cut into which, but the image is now linked with something that has no perceptual or narrative logic to it. So the cut occurs when the negative begins and the positive ends, but the cut has no place within anything that could make sense of it. It's been linked. In a sense, it's continuous. It's the same film strip. So we're seeing the same thing, the same event unfold, but all of a sudden it becomes a negative rather than a positive. This is the kind of thing that I believe that Deleuze has in mind when he talks about irrational cutting, irrational editing, and the relinkage of segments of film in accordance with a new kind of logic, which is governed by stochastic, probabilistic, non-determinative principles of the filmmaker. And so just as neural transmission is a probabilistic event that occurs across the neural gap, the putting together of a whole film by a modern filmmaker is a probabilistic event that occurs across the gaps created by these irrational cuts. And this is what ultimately Deleuze means by a cinema of the brain. He also, of course, has this idea of the inside becoming the outside and the outside becoming the inside. But I think what that refers to is what I've been talking about is the brain writ large. So there's a brain in Alphaville, and the brain is alpha 60, right? In some ways, it's a very maudlin film, but I think that I don't think that that's the point that Godard wants to make. He's not a maudlin filmmaker, but in some ways you could read the film as simply cold logic versus emotion, science versus poetry, technology versus human interaction or whatnot. But Godard is a more sophisticated filmmaker than that. The film has that overt structure.
And the worst ever person to do a voiceover in the or narrative voiceover in the film, that voice, it just annoyed the crap out of me.
I love that. Of course, that's Alpha 60, right?
I know. I mean, for a computer voice, it was horrible. It was but it also made me laugh.
Yeah, that's a great. Yeah, I agree with you. It's a great voiceover. But Lemmy Caution, first of all, is a comic strip character. I think actually a graphic novel character in France after the war. And there's this one great part of the film where he asks his associate, the other agent who's been sent to Alphaville by the outer countries to act as a spy, whom he finds, right? He asks him, is Dick Tracy still around? is Flash Gordon still here? One of the great things that Godard does in the movie is he distributes names like that. So there's this great scene, it's this quick scene where Lemmy Caution is introduced to two scientists, Dr. Heckle and Dr. Jekyll. It's an hilarious bit, right?
I wondered when he asked that if those are like code names or something.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, the Dick Tracy stuff. I wasn't sure.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think that we're meant to get the idea that there's something very unusual going on here. In other words, this is really like a comic strip fantasy. And like I said, that's who Lemmy Caution is. That's the central character.
Yeah, and look at his name.
Right. Yeah. And so Lemmy Caution plays a, kind of a Dick Tracy type character, detective, a hard-boiled, hard-drinking, womanizing detective, very much in place in the film noir of the period, even though this is from a graphic novel. But here now, what Godard does is he makes him the center of a, this drama that occurs about the Alphaville, which is a society, and then Professor von Braun. Clearly, that was the head of the U.S. space program, the ex-Nazi scientist head of NASA, Werner von Braun, right? And it's his name that the scientist in the film who creates, I was going to say Hal, who creates Alpha 60 has. So in other words, and there are all kinds of references to the Holocaust too. The women in particular have numbers tattooed into their skin, and Godard looks at the numbers. Well, clearly that's a reference to the concentration camps. Lemmy Caution he plays his cover is that he's a journalist for Figaro, for Pravda Figaro, or Figaro Pravda. I don't know if that means anything to you. Figaro is the conservative, elite newspaper in France. It's the newspaper that the wealthy read. And Pravda, of course, is the Soviet press. And so by saying that he's a representative of the Figaro Pravda, he's telling us that, in this society, the Cold War is over, right? It means nothing.
Well, I thought that was just a big joke, too.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think actually one way to look at the film is that it is a critique of technocracy. It's a critique of a society where the totalitarian logic of the Third Reich is no longer carried out by a charismatic individual, but by the structure of the society itself. It's a Third Reich without Hitler. It's a Third Reich in which the suppression of the personality is justified in terms of efficient functioning. And of course, this is what Alpha 60 is meant to do. It's create a society that works perfectly by getting rid of every element that is not completely predictable, controllable, deterministic, and so on. And there was a lot of writing about this.
Or emotional. I mean, that scene of the executions.
Right.
Was, the one man being executed because he wept when his wife died.
Right. Yeah, you can't do that. You can't cry at all. There's one point where Natasha sheds a tear, but she says that it's forbidden, so she's not crying. Right? Crying is forbidden. But then there's also this other theme, and it's a theme that runs throughout Godard's movies, and that is the relationship of the written word to the film image. So poetry occurs in the film. It's often a matter of, we think of it as the sort of warm emotional current that is antithetical to Alphaville, to the society run by the gigantic brain. But it's also Godard's working with text, working with visual text, and you see this all the time in his movies, including numbers that are shown on electrical readouts of the period. You will see, letters on screen many times in Godard's films, and he treats them like images in irrational cuts. They're put together in various ways which are unique and certainly don't obey any obvious logic.
This is interesting, because when I first started watching the movie, I thought it was going to be some sort of classic noir sort of murder mystery. Right. I had no idea it was a science fiction film. Right. And then it took me a little while, and then I thought, okay, it's Godard, it's weird, the bathroom scene and everything. And then it wasn't until it starts moving, probably about 15 minutes into the film, and, and just some of the references then started to say, okay, you know, when he talked about the outer lands, then it became clear that there was some sort of distinction here, that it was a science fiction film. But it really starts out as looking very much like a Hollywood classic noir murder mystery film.
Exactly. And this is something that interested Godard. You know, it's what inspired Breathless, and it's, you know, in part what inspired Alphaville as well. But of course, he plays with the genre in ways that nobody had ever anticipated. None of the makers of noir film anticipated, certainly. The other thing that's kind of astonishing about the movie, and it's almost a theatrical technique, and that is that, and actually this is done by other modernists, like, for example, Cyberberg, or even better, the Straub Huillet, which is the husband and wife team that he refers to in the film. One of the things that they do a kind of a story about Rome. It's a story about ancient Rome, but the story is done in contemporary Rome. So you see behind the places where, you know, the arcade, or the arboreal places where the thing is shot, you see the contemporary city of Rome with its cars going through the street in the background, right? Well, what I'm referring to here in Alphaville is the fact that this futuristic film is shot, but without any attempt to alter the fact that they're shooting it in Paris, that he's driving a car between galaxies, that he's just in the ordinary hotels and, you know, ordinary spaces in Paris. But the story gets told as though there was a whole different world there, you know, a world of intergalactic travel and kinds of things, without for a second altering the the actual material of the film image. I think it's fascinating that he's able to do that. I like Alphaville, I have to say. It's a funny movie, you know, and I think it's a mistake not to see the elements of comedy in Godard's films, too. Godard, I hate to tell you, also appreciated the work of Jerry Lewis.
Is there one person in France who doesn't? Just kidding. French people who are watching.
I know. He was revived as, you know, the whole idea behind the kind of interpretation that was developed by Cahiers du Cinema under Andre Bazin's editorship was focused on the notion of the auteur, right? The auteur is the filmmaker who is to the film what the novelist is to the novel. And this was the elevation, the great elevation of the director from functionary of the studios, right? Just sort of the boy who takes the orders and does what he's told, to the level of the artist. You know, that's what occurred during that period in France. And Jerry Lewis was accepted into the list of auteurs. You know, there are some American filmmakers were not, but Lewis was one of them. Hitchcock certainly was one of them. I don't know if you noticed, but last year at Marienbad has a Hitchcock walk-on, except it's not a walk-on. It's a strangely Alain Resnais version of a Hitchcock walk-on. There's a scene, it's a quick scene in the hotel where Hitchcock is just standing completely motionless and in a darkened area of the hotel. And the focus of the image is not on him, but there he is. You know? So there was a Hitchcock walk-on in last year in Marienbad.
Was it actually him or a stand-up cardboard or something?
No, it was him. It was him. Yeah, he did a favor for Alain Resnais. And so that's the interesting thing, that all of these filmmakers who were doing such avant-garde work were also interested in Hollywood film. You know, they were the ones who upgraded these characters. You know, John Huston and Ford and Minnelli, people like this. You know, the makers of musicals. I elevated them to the level of auteurs. You know. And Godard tried to get away from that, actually, in his radical period. So the films that he made with the Ziga Vertov group did not have a directorial name on them, and they were conceived of as collective products. And there have been other filmmakers who've tried to do this as well, including Straub and Huillet. they've also tried to conceive of films as the collective product of the cameramen, the actors and actresses, the grip handlers, everybody who's involved in the production of a movie. But unfortunately, this auteur concept has stuck, and so it's probably been one of the most lasting creations of that period in French cinema, the idea of the auteur. So, but Godard, obviously, even the films that he made for the Ziga Vertov group, they're still shown as Godard films. So he never was really able to escape from that. He then went on to make videos, and he began to do production for television, became very interested in the video image. Godard did. And this plays into something that happens in Deleuze's book toward the end, where he starts to talk about the video and the digital image. And you had asked this question last week, Pixels, where do what happens to the digital image from this vantage point? Well, this is 1985 when the book is published, so digital art is in its real infancy. I mean, you can see some of it in gallery shows, but certainly not, nearly. It's not ubiquitous. And computers, the personal computer is just starting, to take hold, and the internet is still pretty much around the corner, and so we're at a very early stage here. But Deleuze does say that we don't know what's going to happen with the electronic image, and that the electronic image may be a continuation of the film image in a way that we don't yet understand, or it may be the beginning of a new kind of image. And so, the electronic image for him at that stage is mostly video and video art. So the figure that he quotes there is what's his name? Nam June Paik, the video artist, the Fluxus video artist, the Korean video artist who made such a splash in New York and elsewhere. And so he quotes him on the nature of the video image, but he assimilates that to the digital image. And now it's unfortunate that he didn't spend more time reflecting on this, because Godard is the modern philosopher who creates a theory of the virtual, of virtuality, before the digital revolution, and so before the word virtual reality is introduced. And so he develops the theory, and it would have been very interesting to see him apply it to the digital image and to develop those thoughts. But it wasn't a direction that he went in. These are just comments toward the end of the book, on the future of the image. On the other hand, he thinks that film making is here to stay. So whether digital imagery branches off from filmmaking or not, filmmaking is still a young art, according to Deleuze.
Have you seen the film called Moon?
What was the maker?
It was made in 2009. It's actually David Bowie's son, Duncan, and it was his debut film, and it got wonderful reviews. And it's basically about a guy in space who's on a mission, who's alone. And it's a 3-year mission where he has to send, where he's harvesting something off the moon to send back to the Earth for power. And it turns, and then turns out that he may or may not be actually human, or could be something else, or it's just a study of isolation. But it also has another aspect to it. I don't want to give it away too much.
Now that you're telling me about it, I haven't seen it. This is David Bowie's son, you said?
Yeah, and he's becoming a really good filmmaker, and he's actually going to be directing the film version of Warcraft, Worlds of Warcraft. But but Moon was his debut film, and it's a low budget film, but it's really well made, and it's a great story.
I'll tell you. Go ahead.
Yeah, and that whole idea, though, of it really deals with the psychology of isolation, but it also brings into other questions of science, humanity, and so forth like that. And if I say too much, then I give away a little bit of the plot, which I don't want to do. But if you can get a chance to see it, I think it's a good film.
Well, operating in accordance with the principle of similarity, his father was a producer of great digital imagery. The thing that was released when he died, when David Bowie died, the last album that he did, I forget, what was the name of it? Dark something?
Black something, dark.
Black what? Black Star.
Yeah.
Black Star. Right. Yeah. The music videos he did for that were absolutely fantastic. Astonishing pieces of work.
I mean, so for somebody to do, basically, he created an album that was his own eulogy,
That's right.
which is genius.
And he did it. And he did it as a consummate artist. Those music videos are absolutely wonderful.
But his whole life of performing, he was two very distinct people, which a lot of people always thought of him just as David Bowie, but he was actually pretty much once he sort of settled down.
Did he start out?
Once he married Connie, he married Emon, and his life changed a little bit. He built a very distinct wall between David Bowie the performer and David Bowie the person.
Yeah.
So what's interesting about those last videos is they, to me, sort of bring about kind of a connection of those two people in a way that he's actually, as himself, is dealing with his death, his sickness, his illness, and that part of him is a real person, and then still being the performer.
Yeah.
But all of those different incarnations that he created throughout his life as a performer, he's brilliant.
Yeah, he's an interesting and complex figure. There's no doubt about it. I liked the film that he was in, The Man Who Fell to Earth. I thought it was a very good science fiction film. And Bowie did a good job playing the alien in the movie.
He's been in a couple of films. You talked about musical. He was in Absolute Beginners, which is a weird musical. And then, of course, he was in that vampire film with Susan Sarandon and Catherine Deneuve.
Right, yeah, that's a great movie, too. Yeah, I forget the name of that movie. Yeah, that is a good film. What's the name of that? What the hell's the name of that movie? I'm blanking now. But yeah, Catherine Deneuve ends up sort of devouring everybody.
As she should.
Right.
I worked a Golden Globes event in Hollywood, and we would get I was in PR for the studio, so we would be assigned people, and she was actually one of the people I was assigned to.
Really?
To just make sure, she had her, whatever she needed. She was very lovely. She was a very nice lady.
Right.
But, you just approached her with, a certain amount of distance and awe because of who she was.
Sure. I could see that. She was also the star of Buñuel's film. Oh, God. What's the name of it? Belle de Jour. Yeah, it's Louis Buñuel.
Oh, yeah. She's been in a lot of she's been in a lot of films. She's also very good with comedy.
That I did not know.
She plays. She has a streak of. One of her earliest movies, it's very early, it's a fantasy film called Donkey something, but I don't know what the actual French, but it's based on a fairy tale.
Oh. Well, this is good. This class is ending with, star awe and worship. David Bowie, Catherine Deneuve, as all movie classes should end.
Well, I think there's so many other directors, though, that are mentioned. I think that the problem with, in trying to, I think this is like a class that actually should even be maybe like two classes, where the first book is just, you focus on the first half of the book, and a lot more of those films are encouraged to be viewed and then do the second half, because there's so many movies, like I said, everybody can watch these films, but the reason I didn't like Marienbad was it had absolutely no, to me, narrative structure at all, anything. And not that I need that, but I just felt it was really pretentious.
Wait a minute, it does have a narrative structure.
I felt it was pretentious, though.
Seduction, right? It's an attempted seduction, but that's the narrative of what actually happens in the hotel. But the whole thing is obviously about memory.
Right. Right, but I think it's just in a sense there is some slight linear element to it that follows, but I just felt it was like poser, you know. Everybody was it was just so focused on it.
Well,
To me,
yeah,
it felt very pretentious about the posing of everybody
wait
constantly.
a minute. Can't you see that that is the strategy of the filmmaker? These are
I,
not people.
I,
They're not characters in the film. They're mannequins. You know,
I get that part of it, that's part of it, but I think but what I did love about the film,
yeah.
hands down, and made me want to recreate this in 3D was the production design of that thing was just off the hook.
I mean, of the hotel itself.
The set design, yeah, that was just, you know, that was phenomenal.
Yeah.
That part of it to me was incredible. But I didn't. I mean, I got the whole point of the film. I understood, you know, the seduction and the back and forth and so forth. But it just didn't resonate with me like
The
what
best, the best,
Je t'aime did, which I felt had a much more emotional connectivity and a much more relatable character.
Je t'aime is about a man who attempts suicide, and he begins by failing the suicide. So all we know is that there is someone who attempted suicide who is in a hospital, and he's in critical condition, and it's not clear whether he's going to survive or not. But he does survive, and he's approached by some scientists who are doing experiments in time travel. And so they ask him, figuring that he's got nothing to lose, right? They ask him if he'd be interested in being a guinea pig in their experiments. And the guy says, okay. So they take him back and talk about a brain. You know, there's no clearer representation of a brain than the chamber that they put him in for the time travel process. That thing is a big brain. You know, just I don't know how else to describe it. It's soft like a brain. You know, he sort of melts into it. His body melts into it when he lies down and stuff like that. But he's also got a mouse with him who has taken a trip into the past and supposedly relived one moment or 1 minute in its life and then brought back to the present. But they can't be sure because they can't ask the mouse. And so they have to send a person. And they expect the person to be there for only 1 minute. But he gets caught in time. And so he appears again and again at different places in his past, but the film constantly returns to one scene, and it's a scene of him snorkeling in the ocean, and his girlfriend is lying on the beach, and there's a brief exchange between the two of them. It's kind of a light vacation-y kind of exchange. And the film constantly recycles, or the his experience in time travel constantly recycles to this particular image, and the image doesn't have very much significance. It's hard to figure out. This is a perfect example of what Deleuze calls an irrational cut, and then the reassembly of images.
Except that image is a starting point, to me, of his best memory.
It's a good yes.
That's the best memory. That what happens is you see that repetitive image, and you're not sure why this is. You first get, okay, that's his first memory going back into time, or the point where he goes back into time, and then as each successive sort of jump happens, they add another image, and that image also doesn't necessarily have to be sequential.
Right.
And they add another image again. But that image, you're right, the snorkeling image always seems to be the starting point. And then as each successive image comes, the story unfolds of why he committed suicide.
And this is what Deleuze calls the irrational cut, and then the reassembly of images. But actually, as the film goes on, it's a rather conventional film in some sense, because what you're doing is you're trying to put together the sequencing in chronological order. It doesn't occur in chronological order, but you are reconstructing the chronological order to figure out what this guy's life is about, and you ultimately are able to do it. You're able to reconstruct it so that the suicide, for example, makes complete sense. But the process of time travel that's been depicted is one of the irrational cut. Also, the sheets of past, that's all in there. It's a great film, actually, to illustrate a number of concepts that Deleuze develops in cinema.
And that's why I love the movie. I mean, why it resonated with me was the fact that it wasn't linear in the sense, I mean, it does unfold, but it brings scenes in that are not, there's no continuity necessarily. So
Right.
you have to kind of create the continuity and the storyline as it keeps giving you more material to work with,
Right.
until you get to the point where you understand, okay, from that, you know, how everything happened in leading up to his suicide.
And that's the technique that Orson Welles pioneered in Citizen Kane. It's exactly what happens in Citizen Kane. Through the medium of the interviews of Thompson with the people who knew Kane, we are given information out of sequence. And we put together in our own minds the narrative that finally, you know, stitches everything together. We're helped considerably there by the newsreel, which is initially in proper sequential ordering. But the deeper stuff that comes out through the interviews, we have to sort of connect. And so this is why Deleuze calls Orson Welles the great inventor of the direct time image. Why Citizen Kane is so important to him. And so Rene is in a sense a kind of disciple of Orson Welles. Where are we now? Well, Deleuze does talk about third world cinema in interesting ways, but ultimately I think he's off base there. He talks about third world cinema, and he also says this for Straub and Huillet, that it's a cinema in which the people are missing. And by saying that the people are missing, what he wants to do is distinguish third world cinema from left-wing European film, which is still caught in the idea of the people. Well, in France, the people is the correlate of the national state. In other words, the concept of the people comes into existence at the same time as the French nation state emerges, the French Revolution occurs, and then the French Revolution is kind of the paradigm for left politics afterward. And so Deleuze thinks that we're beyond that, and that therefore the cinema of the third world no longer deals with that topic. In other words, the liberation of the people. But I think that's completely wrong, and I think that's a really deep misreading of the nature of third world cinema post, let's say, 1968, including the figures that he mentions, including Glauber Rocha and Sembeni, and there's some others as well, but Brazilian film and African film in particular. I don't think that they were ever caught in the French Revolution paradigm. And so, there's the left in Latin America and in Africa has always been unique. It's not something recent. And it's not that the people, it's just that the people doesn't make any sense in these contexts. I mean, for example, think about Africa. There's a great book written by an Africanist, a British Africanist. His name is Basil Robertson. And the book is called Black Man's Burden. And Robinson makes the point, and it's almost a truism now, that one of the difficulties that decolonization in Africa faced was that it occurred within the context of nation states that was created by European colonialism. And so what happened was the new nations that emerged from decolonization were artificial constructions in which tribal divisions were crisscrossed by national boundaries that didn't accord with tribal configurations. And so what you got was different groups struggling for control over this artificial entity, which was the chief focus of power in these societies. And so for Robertson, this is in part an explanation for the endemic civil wars that have followed in Africa, followed decolonization in Africa. And I don't think Glauber Rocha was ever a Brazilian nationalist. He never really talks about the people. Maybe I'm overdoing it a little bit, because there was an element of sort of Fidel Castro / Che Guevara in him. The people united will never be defeated and so forth. But none of this has to do with a nation-building project. What Rocha is interested in is the role that myth plays in the creation of an autonomous culture in Brazil, mostly among people who have been have strains of both Native America and Africa in them, and so and developing an approach to myth which is unique to that. So I think to judge the films in that respect, as though they had sort of, that's always been the context for liberation politics in Latin America.
Do you remember the film that I remember that was, well, it was, I don't know technically if you could consider it a true African film, but the one I think that first came out that had major attention was The Gods Must Be Crazy.
Right. Yeah, I forget now who made that. It wasn't
I can't remember for the life of me who it is. I could look it up, but I remember the film distinctly.
Yeah, it got mass distribution. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, whereas Sembeni's films never did, and Sembeni is clearly the the dominant figure in African film in the say post 1960 period. It didn't get wide circulation. Rocha is not very well known either in the States anyway, but he's probably the greatest Latin American filmmaker. He's also dead. He's been gone for a while now. Well, in any event, there's a great deal to mine in the 2 volumes of cinema. And Pixels, you're absolutely right. You cannot do it in a semester. You can't do it in 2 semesters. One of the things that I wanted to do with the course was to give people a kind of roadmap through the 2 volumes to see what Deleuze is actually talking about, what's actually going on. What you have to do now, if you want to continue, is to do exactly what you said, which is go back to the films. Watch as many of them as you can. Consult Deleuze's treatment of the films in the 2 volumes. See where he makes sense and where he doesn't. It's not all holy writ, right? He hasn't written the Bible on cinema.
Well, also, he doesn't, he goes up to a point, and I think it would be really interesting to take, for somebody who's very familiar with this topic, perhaps, and has taught many classes on it, to maybe write a book that takes it from that point up to now, because he cuts off at a certain level, and there's filmmaking hasn't stopped, and it hasn't stopped being experimental either, particularly now that we have, like I said when we talked last time, people are making films with iPhones, like Tangerine, that are actually that are actually being released theatrically. Right. And winning awards and so forth. So I think that is important, but also also maybe breaking it down. I think we talked about this before, maybe breaking it down into a course on Hitchcock, or a course just on Godard, or maybe a course just on the French film makers, and a course just on the Brazilian or Latin American, or because then I think you have a better focus.
You mean all from a Deleuzian perspective? Is that what you mean?
Well, I think you could use that as a very loose structural thing and refer to it, but I don't think he's the only person either that's been interested in film, not just from a philosophical perspective, but from a lot of perspectives.
I don't know if you've been to my website, but this is the 8th thing. I think it's the 8th class I've taught in a series of courses on philosophy and film. And so one of them, for example, was about early Soviet film. I've focused on, actually the next course I want to give, I think would make an interesting class, is a film on Hitchcock and Welles, Alfred Hitchcock and Orson Welles, because there are interesting connections between these 2 characters, and certainly they can be approached from a lot of different angles. But Mac, what the hell are you laughing about?
Yeah, I know. I'm watching him. He's smiling. He's muted. And
Mac, talk to us.
You need to unmute him, Gary. Oh, there.
Yeah, he can do it.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
It's just my housemate here is making me laugh.
Well, tell them to start behaving. I'm taking 2 points off your grade, Mac. Mac's, of course, not getting a grade for the class.
Well, I mean, I really enjoyed the course, and the book is very dense. I mean, you have to go back. We've skipped elements of it, and I have to go back and reread it. And because he references so many films, and if you haven't watched the film, then I think it's you're missing out a little bit.
Right.
And even though we've covered certain films that sort of relate to each chapter,
Absolutely. And I'll tell you something, if you spent the rest of your life trying to watch every film that he references, you still wouldn't get to the end. He's got his own database of movies that he's accumulated over the course of his lifetime by the time he writes this thing, and nobody's going to match that. We have our own databases of films, if you want to put it that way. So it's always going to be somewhat frustrating. There will be films that he refers to that we haven't seen. It's a good idea to see a movie by each of the directors that he talks about. I think that's helpful. But the book is rich, and I'll tell you what my own take on the 2 volumes is. It's first of all, they've made a huge impact. You asked this last week. Have they actually had an effect on film students and film teachers and so forth? And the answer to that is absolutely, to the point where critical articles now just routinely reference the 2 volumes. And so I think he's widely regarded, and properly regarded, by film theorists as being the most important, certainly, philosopher to write on film. And there's an interest in philosophy among people who think of themselves as theorists in any of the humanities. But my own view of Deleuze's work is that it's not principally a book about movies. I know this sounds odd. I think that the 2 volumes is principally a book about time. And if I had to describe the project that Deleuze is involved in, I would call it the project of developing an ontology in which time is central. And here he's not doing, the general project is part of a whole group of projects that developed in the 19th and 20th centuries to reconceive of reality, to reconceive of being on the basis of very radically altered conceptions of time that have occurred in physics, in philosophy, in literature, in film. And what I like about the 2 volumes of cinema is that he uses film almost as a kind of scientific instrument for opening up a dimension of the experience of time that we don't normally focus on, in ways that we wouldn't focus on. And the reason why is because he treats filmmakers as thinkers. They think in images rather than concepts, but they're thinkers, and philosophers create, even though they create in concepts rather than images. And so the distance between filmmaking and philosophy is not as great as many people think. And so he follows the lead of the great filmmakers, but he follows their lead in his own attempt to develop a new ontology based in a conception of time that's adequate for our own period. And that's where I think the brilliant advances in Deleuze's book are. Think of it, by reading this book, you can see somebody like Orson Welles or Alain Resnais as an important figure in understanding the revolutions in time that have occurred as Martin Heidegger or as Henri Bergson. And this is very interesting. And the other part that I think is important here is that he says this just in the very last page of the book, that the important stuff, I don't remember his phrasing, but the important stuff happens when philosophy intersects with another field. And it's at that point of intersection that new thoughts can arise. So the traditional conception of the philosopher as someone who thinks in isolation is not correct. It's only when you get that crossing that interesting things happen. And I think that's true right from the beginning of philosophy. Plato was at the intersection of philosophy and developments in mathematics. And that's where his thought flowered. And so what Deleuze is doing is both ancient and contemporary, but it's giving us a way to think about this new machine that was developed in the late 19th century, and which has, as Zygmunt Vertov knew that it would, has extended human sensory capacities in ways that we could not have imagined. Even Vertov could not have imagined, now with the development of digital imagery. In relation to this incredible machine, we can reopen the question of what time is and what reality is. And that's very significant for philosophers and for students of philosophy.
It's also incredibly influential on society as well.
Yeah.
You know, the kinds of the types of films that were released during certain eras, the limitations of them, films with political leanings, you look at, or even documentaries, you look at Michael Moore's films, messages that are being, you know, the way that it's being, that film is being used in a way as an entertainment, but in some ways it has a subversive element to it in order to either tweak people's perceptions or encourage what they already believe in, you know, cement that encouragement.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at like theological films that are coming out now that are done as like you know, family entertainment, but they certainly have a very specific theological message, you know, that this is the way you should think. And you know, but they're being marketed as, you know, just like a film, like, you know, and it's interesting to you know, to see how film can be used in that way.
Right. You reminded me, actually, talking about that, one topic that I didn't touch on that I'd wanted to in the pages that we read for this week is what Deleuze calls the spiritual automaton and the psychological automaton. The word spiritual automaton comes from Spinoza again. And the idea in Spinoza is that we think in accordance with the same kind of necessary connections between our thoughts that mechanical automata move in accordance with the movements of their gears. In other words, the thought process is as determined in its unfolding as the motion of a wind-up automaton. What Deleuze does with this is he says that there are two dimensions of this. You know, one is what he calls the spiritual automaton, and what that refers to is Spinoza and also Leibniz's conception, Leibniz in particular's conception of essentially a pre-computer conception of programming, that there is a symbol system that has, you can create a symbol system that has rules in which symbols are connected with one another in accordance with the rules that either emulates or is every possible thought process. And this is later, you know, what's at the center of the computer revolution. But and then Deleuze contrasts this and compares it with the psychological automaton. The psychological automaton is the ability of people to be manipulated in accordance with such rules. And so, for example, the propaganda machine of the Third Reich or of Stalinist Russia or, you know, whatever. And so, and he says that both of these come into a new kind of incarnation with the development of cinema, because what the motion image is an automaton. In other words, it's a sequence of images that unfold mechanically. I mean, literally, right? Because you've got that celluloid strip, or whatever it is in the video equivalent, you know, running through the projector frame by frame. And so the film, in a sense, is doing our thinking for us. It's it's an automaton. And then he refers to something very unsavory, which is the movies of the Third Reich. And so you think of a film like, very famously, Triumph of the Will, Leni Riefenstahl. Leni Riefenstahl was a German filmmaker. She specialized in films that were associated with the Back to Nature movement, especially of young mountain climbers in Germany in the 1920s. And then she became kind of an official filmmaker for the Third Reich, and she filmed Hitler's Nuremberg rally in the film Triumph of the Will. And she's one of the great modern filmmakers. But with her, filmmaking becomes a way of it's a part of the Nazi propaganda machine that treats the thought processes of Germans as mechanical automata that can be manipulated to move in a certain rigid fashion, and it works.
It goes back to the films like Reefer Madness and all of these films that were shown to instill fear into people, or to
I was a communist for the FBI. That's another movie. Another movie.
Is that for real? Is that a real movie?
No, that's for real.
Oh my God, that's funny. Well, and then when you talk about Lenny, I can never remember her last name.
Riefenstahl.
Riefenstahl. There's a film, I don't know if I mentioned it last time, but I stumbled across it, and it's called Look Who's Back.
Oh yes, I've seen it.
Have you seen? Did you watch it?
Yes, I did.
The one about Hitler coming back?
Yes. Oh, that's a great film.
It's hilarious, but it's also disturbing because it's a combination of regular narrative, fictional filmmaking combined with some real documentary elements in it.
Now, who is it? Is that Straub, or is that who made that film?
I can't remember. I got to go look it up. But it's really, really funny, but it's also disturbing because it has as a lot of the reviews of people said, it has a very distinct feeling of like what's happening in the United States, like with Donald Trump, and this kind of.
Okay. I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying. Yeah. There's a great film by Cyberberg. Cyberberg is one of the post-war generation of German filmmakers, modern filmmakers, like Werner Herzog and Fassbinder and people like that. Cyberberg did a movie called From Out of Germany. You wanted to devote some time? 5 hours long. 5 hours long. And it's about Hitler. But it's the most unusual treatment of Hitler I have ever seen. It takes place in a kind of stage set where filled with mannequins and objects and backdrops and things like that. And characters appear in the midst who have lines. 7.5 hours. 7.5 hours, Max says. Yeah. It appears, but their characters who have lines. Hitler's valet is in it. Hitler's his masseur is in it. Hitler never really appears. At least I don't think Hitler appears. I haven't seen all 7.5 hours, but it's a fascinating treatment of Hitler within the context of what this is, not as a foreign phenomenon, but as something that's sort of continuous with our reality. It's both scary and fascinating. From Out of Germany. Yeah, the German filmmakers, all of the great ones, have to grapple with this issue. In Germany, of all of the countries, there was concern about what was going to happen when Germany reunified. Are we going to get another? What is that?
That's the link to Look Who's Back. And one of the interesting things about it, it's contemporary. It was made like in the last couple years. So it's also dealing with the Syrian refugee issue. That there's some stuff that comes up in the end of it, and some of the new sort of neo-Nazi movements that are happening. But it's a comedy. It's basically, there's a landmark where Hitler's bunker is in Germany. And Hitler wakes up in 2014, and he's trying to adapt, and he becomes a stand-up comedian because, of course, nobody takes it seriously that it's actually him, that he's just this genius, impersonator. Mm-hmm. But his message is the same message he was preaching, back when he was the Führer, and it's really, really funny, and at the same time it's very disturbing because there are some, there's pictures of him riding in a car down the street waving, and people are all excited and they want to do selfies with him. And, it's Hitler. It's just so bizarre, but it's really it's a very thought-provoking film. And it's a German film, so it's subtitled, but it's good.
I was going to say the Germans have never stopped grappling with this. And the worry that somehow by reuniting Germany was going to return to a fascist state is about as far from the truth as you can get. The country that's never dealt with its history of fascist atrocity is Japan. They've never admitted to the destruction of Nanjing or parts of Mongolia, the human experimentation, the atrocities of every bit as horrendous as the ones the Nazis were engaged in.
I have a friend whose grandmother, this is an interesting story. His grandmother was a girl from Kentucky who met a Japanese diplomat before World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And in New York, and they fell in love, and of course it was not encouraged because it was considered an interracial marriage, but they did get married, and he was a diplomat, and then the war started, so they had to go back to Japan. And he was a sort of a intermediate correspondent, or did something for Hirohito at the time. And so there were these letters but she ended up coming back to the United States because they had a child. And, it was just, at one point they were starving to death. I mean, literally, they went from being diplomats in the United States to starving peasants in Japan because, they were sent back because he was Japanese during the war. And there was a film based on it, but I believe there might be a book about it or something. It's just a really interesting story. And you're talking about the fascism and so forth, but the people that actually lived through that in different ways. To be an American person married at that time, when of course, first of all, that was considered taboo, and then secondly, to have World War II happen right in the midst of your marriage to somebody. And then to be deported to a country you've never lived in with a child, and then have a baby and a child, and then suddenly, be living in just abject poverty, and then finally to, be able to get back to the United States. And I don't know if they were ever reunited, if she ever saw her husband again, because of that. But it's a.
I'm a little bit concerned because Mac has his hat on now.
Oh.
Mac, are you getting ready to leave or what? Or is your head just cold?
Yeah, no, I'm going through an artist talk again.
Oh, I lost you. I can't get you on screen. Oh, there you are. There you are. Okay. I just wanted to put the spotlight on you for a second. We're winding down here. We're like in the last 5 minutes of the class. You've been with us right from the beginning. You've been a stalwart. You haven't missed a single class, and so we have a prize for you later. it'll be coming in the mail. I just want to give you.
I lost Gary's sound.
I just wanted to give you the opportunity to say something before we wind up. Would you?
Oops, can't hear Gary anymore.
You can't hear me, Pixels. You can't hear me. Can you hear me now?
Hear me?
Oh, there we are. Okay.
I can hear you, Mac. Go ahead.
Well, I would just say that I am planning on kind of going back through it again and watching some of these movies and really trying to figure out, kind of precisely what he's saying in some of the parts. And I've already started doing that. So it's just starting, right, like Volume 2 especially. I'm starting with the Italian neo-realist section. I've been watching Rossellini and his War trilogy and some of his other stuff.
You're watching Rossellini now? You said? So
Yeah.
Rome Open City, Pisa, and then what is it?
Germany Year Zero.
Yeah, Zero. Yeah. That's serious. Go ahead, Pixels.
Mac, as an art historian, if you're going to make a relevant kind of take like Deleuze's theory and apply them to art,
Yeah.
what would that be like? Like artists that you would think that their imagery or so forth would apply to some of his philosophical ideas about. Although he's talking about moving images, but still, I think it applies to some of the composition and images.
Well, what I think is really impressive about Deleuze is that he does take so many films and fit them into a philosophical structure where they all have their place, and so I think it's kind of an exercise in doing that, and then once you kind of follow how Deleuze does it, I'm thinking that it should be possible to do it with other kinds of art in a similar fashion.
You know, Deleuze wrote a book on Francis Bacon, the painter, and that book has had a big impact on the visual arts. You know, I'm talking about the visual arts outside of cinema. So references to Deleuze by art critics and art theorists are very common now. Deleuze, in the United States, Deleuze has been more influential in art circles than in philosophical circles. Which is,
could be.
Yeah, I think it's true. Well, the United States is dominant. Philosophy is dominated by analytic philosophy anyway. So it's not strange that a French philosopher would not, have that much circulation among U.S.-based philosophers. But he has had a big impact on the arts. Yeah. And so that's another reason why I wanted to give the class is that film theorists and critics do refer to Deleuze quite a bit, and they don't always refer to him with the full understanding of the philosophical context. They know the film history, and they know the film context quite well, but the philosophical context is a little bit difficult for them to grasp, because Deleuze is a classically trained philosopher. You know, he's dealt with these figures in great depth for many, many years, and that's sort of presupposed by what he writes in the book. But he's certainly a major figure, and deservedly a major figure. I just want to thank you, Mac, for sticking with us, and Pixels for coming on and participating so nicely in the class. I want to thank both of you. And I thank my UMass students who have a paper to write now, and before, as we wind up the semester. I'm going to be giving a course on Marxist philosophy in the fall, and that's going to be, it's not an online course, that's a bricks and mortar course, but I'm thinking about setting up a video stream, and from that into something like Hangouts, so that people who want to participate in it and who are not in Boston can do so. And so we can stream the class again into through Hangouts and then into YouTube. And so if anyone wants to participate, I'll put that word out when it comes closer to the time. But that class starts in the fall, in September of this year. But in any event, it was an interesting process. Mac, you've taken two things with me so far. I've enjoyed your participation in both of them. We're continuing to develop online classes and extensions of classes and so forth. Actually, if the both of you can hang around for a second, I'd appreciate it. I'm going to end the broadcast now, but I would like to talk to you both real quickly. Is that okay? Do you have an extra minute?
Yep.
Okay, sure. Great. So, okay, folks, I shall see my YouTube audience at some point in the digital future. Bye-bye.